Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to New Canaan Library. Thanks for coming today. As people continue to filter in, could we please take a moment to silence our cell phones? Let me make sure mine is silenced, okay. And note the exits. I think you all know, left, right, behind you. Okay. Come on in. There's plenty of seats up here, up front. And over here on the side. Okay. Welcome. This is our second Spotlight on the Met. I think most of you know that the Met is our country's premier institution for art. It's the most visited museum in the United States with an encyclopedic collection of art and artifacts encompassing over 1.5 million objects from 17 curatorial areas spanning 5,000 years of human history and creativity. New Canaan Library, if I may say so, is our town's premier hub for learning, culture, and community. And that means that through our books, our programs, and our museum passes to the Met and other institutions, we hope to spark something in you, something that brings you greater knowledge, fulfillment, and joy. We're fortunate today to welcome to our stage art historian Page Knox. She's a Met lecturer, also an adjunct professor of art history at Columbia University. And Page has come to once again shine a spotlight on the Met, a place that for some of us is reason enough to never leave the New York area. Indeed, it's easy to get comfortable with the Met as we've always known it. Its galleries, corridors, vitrines, the arrangement, lighting, and scholarship around its works. I confess that I am absolutely guilty of harumphing on more than one occasion at certain, let's call them curatorial choices that perhaps upset my understanding or sense of logic or even taste. Today's focus on the Met's reinstallation of its iconic European paintings galleries is for all of us, not just the grumblers, because being inspired and challenged to rethink how we engage with and understand subjects is absolutely necessary. We just can't learn and grow without it. This is why we're so pleased to have Page here to take us through this collection of over 700 works of art. So please, now let's warmly welcome Page Knox.
Thank you so much. That was a fabulous introduction, and I think maybe we should hire you for the Met. It really is an extraordinary place, and as I said, in cold temperatures when everyone kind of looks to Florida, the Met is a nice reason to stay in the New York area. What I'm going to try to do today is to give you a sense of this collection. It's a collection that was inspirational from the get-go. When you arrive at the Met, you enter into the Great Hall, you march up the stairs, you encounter European paintings. And European paintings was at the heart of the Met's inception in 1870, when the museum begins with no staff, no building, and no collection. And these were some paintings we're going to see that remain. They were acquired for the Met's opening and still there today. But of course, things have changed quite dramatically over the last 150 years. And so there was a decision in recent years to rethink European paintings. So one of the issues that really led to this moment was, and I don't really have it in the shot, were the skylights. So at this particular moment, we now have a beautiful sunny day, but the sunny days sometimes are problematic with the old lighting system, which didn't really accommodate changes in natural light. The old lighting system had been approximately 50 years old. It was time, particularly after things such as the fire at Notre Dame, to rethink what was going on with mechanical and electrical. not a sexy project. You can't put people's names on lighting. So it was a difficult endeavor. But what the Met decided to do was to really revolutionize their lighting system. And in the process, they needed to tear off the entire roof of the building. This was, as I said, a monumental project that took over 5 years and forced the museum to close down much of European paintings. So what happened in the meantime, in addition to all the construction that was going on, was a changing of the guard, new generation of curators coming to the museum who wanted to rethink some major issues about European paintings and what does it mean to be European? How do you define the notion of European? And many people would argue that Europe basically looks like this. Now, this includes Eastern and Western Europe. The primary issue with Europe geographically is that it does not have a border. It doesn't have an ocean. It doesn't have a mountain range. It doesn't have a distinct spot where you can say 1 foot is in Europe and 1 foot is in Asia. It's very difficult, very sort of nebulous to define it. Some people argue that you would look primarily at what we would call Western European. And these are, of course, the countries that we associate in the West, but also then including some elements of Eastern European. Eastern, Western, where does it end? And of course, as we know, these boundaries have changed over time. If you're looking at a map of the EU, we even know that various countries, such as Great Britain with Brexit, leave the EU. So how do you combine all of these different cultures, 24 different languages recognized in the EU, but over 200 languages spoken in this region? How do you come up with a way to think about it cohesively? Most people generally think of these 5 primary countries or areas, 6 of the, would be considered European, which would be Spain, France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. And that is, generally speaking, how the Met used to think about it. But again, what scholars have started to do is to really look back in history and try to understand, where did this concept of Europe come from? Where do we first hear the term European mentioned? We hear it with Herodotus. When Herodotus, who's arguably the first historian, starts to document his travels, he speaks to Europe in a way that makes Europe sound very central. Europe kind of considered to be the mainland. That interpretation also very much stands with the Ptolemies. If you go back to the ancient cartographers, the first geographers, so to speak, who were trying to map and understand the world, they looked to Europe as the center. And we can also think of Europe from a mythological standpoint, the notion of Europa. In the image that you see here on the right, the Rape of Europa, the famous moment when Zeus comes upon this Phoenician princess and whisks her off to Crete, representing Europa, again, as this goddess of culture of the West. So again, getting into that idea of culture, this notion of European starts to become quite crucial when Christendom enters the picture. And we think about concepts such as the Holy Roman Empire, which, as very famously, was not holy, it was not Roman, and it was not an empire. But again, the notion that Christianity somehow, in many ways, defines what is European, and how many of these leaders, starting with people like Charlemagne and his father Charles Martel, appropriated European values to be representative of Christian values. I'm showing you actually an image of the Battle of Tours that took place, very, very important battle in the 1740s, in the 640s. Is it 640s, 740s? But in any case, it's earlier than Charlemagne's time. It's his father. And this was 742, I think. So the battle takes place between the Islamic forces that come from the Iberian Peninsula and battle over this central area in Europe. Now, Charles Martel is victorious, 732, at the Battle of Tours. And ultimately, because of that battle, we have Europe as Christian. And so that idea of Christian values is arguably, the Judeo-Christian tradition is arguably a way in which we can culturally identify what is European rather than trying to think about geography. And of course, these ideals, these European values, are then exported around the world during the time of the colonialist efforts, imperialism, and we see these European values start to make their way to South America, to different parts of North America, and moving essentially around the world. So again, there is a questioning at this stage, scholarly, of these exportation of these kinds of values. And then there's also this idea that if European culture, if Judeo-Christian culture is what defines Europe, how do we define culture? And there was a very important moment in the 19th century where you had people like Matthew Arnold, who talked about culture in a very high-minded way, engaging with the arts, with painting, with sculpture, with music. Someone who was a cultured, intellectual person was aware of these seemingly aesthetic values that reflected the values of high-minded Europeans. But in later years, other scholars, sociologists, started to think about culture in a new way. I would argue in a way that we think more about culture today, which is something that is very individual, something that is very specific to one's own background, a culture that is, again, speaks to one's own specific different background, different heritage. And so these two sort of culture wars were going on even in the 19th century, but certainly very much a part of the conversation about how to define Europe today. Do we see European as one culture, or do we see it as multiple cultures, more individual, more lowbrow, that are in sort of competition with each other to try to get recognition? So again, it's a complicated situation in the sense that trying to define European culture, looking at a Judeo-Christian background, makes things a little bit tricky. And then if you start to suggest that Europeans are cultured, meaning intellectually engaged and thinking logically and rationally, it's very difficult to explain some of the major events of World War II. So that also brings in the question of culture. How do we understand civilization if these things are happening? And then, of course, something that also kind of plays into this whole thing is the culture wars after World War II, when Europe seems to fade from being the center to something in between the Soviet Union and the United States, two countries that are not European, but seem to be controlling now in some way the discussion about European culture and values. So it makes for a very interesting way of thinking about how we understand Europe. Now, one of the other things at the Met, when you enter into European paintings in the sort of entry area, which has the large tiepoloes, they've incorporated 3 maps of Europe that were done at different time periods to make you aware of the porous nature of the whole concept of Europe. And this is actually an Islamic map that was made to really show Mecca as the center and placing Europe somewhat in the margins. Then a map from the 17th century. This is an iconic map made for a man named William Blau, who you see in a lot of the Vermeer paintings. He was a Dutch map maker and representing kind of this moment when the age of exploration, when the Dutch, the British, the French are traveling the world and making maps and improving the knowledge of the actual geography, but also in a way kind of creating a sense of what or how one might define Europe. And then showing you that with wars, with the Napoleonic invasions, and then, of course, the wars to come in World War I and World War II, even the names and the way we visually understand Europe changes because of all of the conflict and, again, this growing nature of the USSR and various countries in Eastern Europe constantly having their border shifted. So what it makes you really aware of is this notion of Europe is flexible, it's fluid, it isn't something that is steadfast. So I love the fact that Tiepolo's paintings remain in the entry area. They remain there, quite frankly, because they're so large, they're so tall, they could never find another place for them. That's the pragmatic reason. But, things are always changing at the museum, and they kept them there. And I think they make an extraordinary statement. Some people see Tiepolo as the last old master, painting in the 18th century at a time when, again, this idea of European values was being contested. Tiepolo was actually painting this series of works for the Kardofan family. This family was an important Venetian family. Many members of that family were in the area around Greece fighting for these Western values, European values, fighting for the Greeks against the Turks. And so these paintings, while they are based on Roman emperors, Roman invasions, Roman battles, really spoke very significantly to the Venetians, the Venetian patron, who felt that in a way they were going to do battle to preserve these values of Europe, of Italy, of Venice. And so you see the moment, this is called the Triumph of Marius. You see Marius up at the top, Roman emperor who has conquered a region in North Africa and brought back the ruler of that region, Golgotha, and he is literally chained as he marches through the streets of Rome. And of course, a classic Roman triumph in which one celebrates the conquest by not only bringing back the booty, all of the jewels and the gems and the natural resources that could be extracted, but also the people, to demonstrate the power of the Roman Empire. And again, this would not be lost on the patrons in Venice. But it's also not lost on Met visitors either. So in the old days, when you marched up European paintings and you saw Tiepolo, there was a great sense of pride, a real sense of triumph as you walked into European paintings, this marvelous bastion of intellectual, cultural collection that the Met has put together over the last 50 years. Now people read the painting differently. When people look at this painting, and again, I'm guilty of this myself, having taught at Columbia for 30 years, we now rethink the way we interpret things. My students often don't focus on Marius. They actually focus on Golgotha. They focus on the loser. They see him as the center of attention, and they also see the objects surrounding him, all of these various decorative arts, pieces of sculpture, marvelous treasures, as being rather emblematic of the Met and European appropriation of going into regions and taking things and bringing them back and making them your own. And so it's a very interesting way of, again, every generation has an interesting narrative, and it's really often the way this painting is now understood. So instead of, again, a triumph of European paintings, it really encourages you to question them. And if you look to either side, these are all part of this series that went into this Venetian palazzo. This is Tiepolo showing you the capture of Carthage. If you're familiar with your ancient history, Carthage was the sort of rival of Rome during the sort of early Republican period. And the Carthaginian Wars, Hannibal, the elephants, was a real challenge to Rome. Rome is, of course, victorious. And so Carthage is put down and burned to the ground. And this is an example of the carnage. Again, this would have been celebrated by Romans and Venetians, but in today's world, we think again about empires moving in, destruction, the inability. It's very hard to really know much about Carthage if you go there today because it was so significantly and substantially destroyed by the Romans. And then, even more interestingly, another painting in the series describes the Battle of Vercella, which is a battle in which the Romans are fighting the barbarians from the north, the Germans. And so, in a sense, it's an interesting way of thinking that Europeans, now finding themselves to be intellectually superior. In the Roman era, many of these European countries were seen as barbaric. So again, kind of rethinking the way we understand European history. Also, what I love that the curators have done, they've sprinkled some objects that you might wonder, and again, it's really intended to encourage you to say, why is this object in the entrance to European paintings. This is an object that I very much love. It's an object that was actually made in Mexico, that was created for a client in Spain, using Japanning techniques that were originated in places like Japan and the Philippines, and kind of speaking about global trade at a time that we don't really think about issues of sort of interwoven globe in the 18th century, but there was a very important trade route from Manila through Mexico over to Spanish ports. And so this really kind of speaks to how objects, aesthetics, are not necessarily made kind of in a vacuum, that they're responding to lots of different types of aesthetics that are coming from around the world. Another object there in that entryway is this portrait bust of a woman. This object obviously comes from our Greek and Roman wing, but it's an image of who is believed to be most likely a portrait of Septimus Severus's third wife, who was Syrian. And her style became all the rage in Rome when people started to adopt more Syrian styles of dress. Also in this section, you see an object from Pakistan, a bust of a Buddha Vista, and this very much speaks to the fact that Alexander the Great, coming from Macedonia, coming from Greece, when he conquers and creates his empire, goes as far east as Pakistan, India. And so some of those types of objects get brought back and then get sort of recirculated into Greco-Roman culture. And then lastly, having just been in Egypt, I'm very excited to see always sort of things that are kind of bring me back to that trip. You see this image of a reclining lion done during the Ptolemaic period, to remind you that the Greeks were ruling Egypt during that late period, we call it the Ptolemaic period, just before Rome conquers Egypt. And so what it really is intended to do is to make you aware that, again, this idea of trying to define Europe or to understand it is much more complex than we think. So to be open and to be receptive to this idea of flexible trading ideas, objects, artists moving around not only Europe, but moving around the globe. So when you enter into the first major gallery, this is a gallery that has seen many changes over the years. Prior to its installation today, you had the head curator, who I absolutely adore and miss very much, Keith Christensen, was a great fan of the Baroque. And he had installed it with all of his most beloved Baroque paintings. This was also intended to kind of encourage audiences from New York to rethink the Met's collection, which had been founded very much in sort of Dutch and Netherlandish and British painting and French painting, painting that tended to sort of shy away from religious subject matter. So he kind of wanted to stir the pot a little bit by having some fairly religious imagery. Now, before that, and for many, many years, if you've been coming to the Met, as I have for quite a number of decades, you may recall that center stage used to be Jacques-Louis David and the great French painters of the Enlightenment. And that idea, when you walked in, first of all, showcased some of the major masterworks that the museum has, but also an idea that this was the era of enlightenment. This was the era of great thinkers. This is the era of old masters. This is the era of the French at the center. And so all of those ideas were very much put forth when you walked in. But as I said, every generation has their idea about how to display this enormous collection. So what did the current generation of curators do? They decided to think about it chronologically. So as I said, in the old days, you had French painting when you walked in, and then you had, actually it was a gallery space on the right, and you had the Dutch paintings, in one section, the British section, then the Spanish section, and you kind of moved from one culture to the next, but you were known and very clear that you were in European paintings. That whole concept has been basically taken away. And the galleries now flow chronologically. So yes, over 700 paintings, and I'm not going to show you every single one, so don't worry. What I'm going to try to do is show you some of the old favorites and see how they've been integrated into this new way of putting European paintings on display and putting them in dialogue and discussion with this notion of interaction, of cultural exchange, whether it's between the various countries of Europe or Europe and the larger world. And so the idea was, how do you define Europe? It seemed to be most strongly these two cultural values, Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian. So we're going to start out essentially with Christianity. So most of the objects are triptychs, many of them are altarpieces, and they all speak to Christian, the church as the primary patron of the time period. What's the time period? It's a time period we call Trecento, Quattrocento, early Renaissance, about 1300 to 1500, sort of in a larger way. And of course, you can see altarpieces that are very beloved in the Met's collection, coming from Siena in the mid-period of the Renaissance, coming from Germany, again, kind of a different aesthetic, but similar subject matter, altarpieces that are not necessarily in the triptych or polyptych form, but also used for the same purposes, that are coming from the Netherlands. This is actually one of my favorites. This is Saturnino Gatti, who shows you this wonderful miracle of the House of Loreto. And this is when you're thinking about transatlantic or global. This is the example of a work of art that has been moved around a lot. So the legend goes that the Virgin, when the angel Gabriel came to her to announce the coming of Christ, the Annunciation, this took place in her home. I believe it was in Nazareth. And during the time period of the Crusades, when Islam comes to the Holy Land, this part of the world was no longer in Christian control, and a group of angels were so concerned that the home of the Virgin might be compromised in some way that they picked it up and they flew it to Laredo. Literally, can you see the little angels? They're going across the sea. All kinds of things happen to this house. It's threatened by pirates. They make a stop in Greece. All kinds of things go on. But if you go to Laredo, you can see this house. It's actually there. And it's believed that a wealthy crusader saw the walls of this house and actually took them down and transported it to Laredo. But it's kind of a fun, to me, if you're thinking about works of art moving around, this is the early example. And then, of course, some wonderful examples of individuals who have to move around. This is the Peruzzi altarpiece. It shows you a family that had been exiled from Florence and had to make their way to the south of France. You can see Avignon in the background, and how they encouraged sort of an Italian-French aesthetic in creating this wonderful altarpiece that was made for a church for their chapel in France. And then, of course, center stage in this exhibition, in this gallery, is Giotto. And this is where you start to really engage in the history of art, who is arguably the beginning of the Renaissance. We know that, it's a kind of a contested place, but Giotto is often kind of the start when he engages with a new naturalism and looks back to Greco-Roman values, to, in many ways, ignore and turn his back on what might have been considered Byzantine. This is the Byzantine style. This is a painting that I love. It's at the Met because it's a great teaching tool. You can sort of say this was what the Renaissance painters were turning away from, which was a more static, more iconic, in the full sense of the word, depiction of the figure. And of course, many of the figures are spiritual figures, so they're not intended to be lifelike in any way. And Giotto is very much responding and pushing against this. And also in this gallery, you see some images of the face of Christ. This is from the Veil of Veronica, which is a very iconic, again, apocryphal tale of a Veronica who sees Christ taking the cross to Golgotha, gives him a towel to wipe his face, and his face appears on the cloth, and it's the first face of Christ. So this is early portraiture right, where you first start to see this, but certainly not portraiture in the way that we understand it. An icon, for sure. And icons, of course, have this a real potent, they are not paintings, they are religious objects. And they participate greatly in veneration. So it's a wonderful demonstration of an icon. And then what I love that the curators have done is they've incorporated some contemporary works to make you rethink the notion of the portrait or the notion of the human face. And of course, also, I should note that our modern and contemporary galleries are closed because we're renovating, building the Tang Wing. So the modern and contemporary curators are very happy to have some of their works interspersed to set up, again, a dialogue about what is portraiture, why do people paint the human figure, why do people paint themselves. So kind of some might, again, take offense to this comparison. I actually love it because Francis Bacon, to me, you either sort of love him or hate him, but he really was about getting at the sort of more, the kind of non-spiritual nature of people, what was really underneath, what was sort of at the core of what makes us all human, and it's not very pretty, versus this very ethereal face of Christ. And then again, you can see modern contemporary threw in their Max Beckmann triptych. Again, a triptych that is not religious. It's not engaged with the Judeo-Christian background. It's really thinking about displacement. So Beckmann has to leave Germany. He is a very controversial artist, and he comes to New York. And he creates this image, which is really an image about loss. It's an image about starting over. It's an image of looking back to his childhood in Germany now that he is this exile in New York. So again, it's a really wonderful collection of traditional, very much focused on Christian imagery, but with some iconic new works kind of folded in to make you rethink and question. Now, when you're in this gallery, what the Met encourages you to do is go left, head south, if you will, and you can make two kind of trips. You can go in two different directions. You can pop into the room right off of this gallery, which shows you more intimate pictures from this time period, particularly our very beloved Duccio, which, if you remember, about 25 years ago, Philippe de Montebello paid quite a large sum for this picture at the time, $44 million, which people were amazed and up in arms. Now it's, the price of an inexpensive Warhol, but, we love this picture, and it was the center of a fabulous show that we had on the Trecento, which was very much really a rich, wonderful, classic old Met show that was enhanced with all of the gold ground paintings we have from this Trecento Sienese moment. But most people will be encouraged to head directly south and move into the gallery known as Portraits of the Renaissance. Now, in the old days, you had the Italians in one room, the Flemish in one room, the Germans in one room. Now we're bringing them all together to show you these faces of this period, the Renaissance, arguably the 1400s, but really about 1450 to about 1500. And what you can see, again, is the idea that not only were painters moving back and forth, patrons were moving back and forth, and objects, works of art, were moving back and forth. So very iconic image. You see on the right the great Renaissance Italian portraits, and they are kind of a foil for what had been going on during the time of that early Renaissance, when you were mostly engaged with images of the Virgin and Child, very spiritual images. There were no portraits. Portraits were really a thing of this time period, and prior to was mostly religious images. And this is, again, a very beloved old master work at the Met, Fra Filippo Lippi, Portrait of a Woman. It's a classic Italian Renaissance portrait. The woman is in profile. You're not interested in her personality. It's all about the clothes she wears, the jewels she has on, the landscape in the background, everything. She's a sight of display. Everything is about who is her family and what she would have just brought to this marriage. Lots of questions about the dude facing her, but we're not going to get into that. So again, you can see it's a real sea change as we're starting to paint real people. And another very beloved painting, but coming from the Netherlands, from the north. So this is Hans Memling, I should say, coming from Flanders. Memling is the inheritor of Van Eyck. Van Eyck, kind of the first, arguably one of the first to paint in oil. And you can see this Flemish style of intensive realism as the two are shown. Incredible attention to details that basically create this real connection that we have with these two individuals. These are Italians. Again, they are coming in the case of Tommaso Portinari. He is the Medici banker that's been sent up to Bruges, and young 14-year-old Maria Baroncelli from Lucca, his bride, has come to join him. So you're seeing Italians moving to Flanders. And then one of the painters that's featured in this room, again, kind of rethinking the way we understand this division of North-South, is Antonello di Messina. Messina comes from Sicily. He sees some of these early Flemish paintings, the story goes, to Flanders, learns about oil painting, brings it back down to Venice, where oil painting then starts to expand all over the Italian continent. It's been this is a very generalized description that's been disputed, but we do recognize Antonello di Messina as the traveling artist who's moving around. And then, of course, you see another Netherlandish portrait next to these marvelous Florentine marriage portraits. And it's really a wonderful way to contrast. We can also see in this room how portraiture starts to evolve, particularly for women. Male portraits were often seen in three-quarter or frontal, but women historically, as I said, sites of display, you're not interested in their personalities, you're interested in their status, their wealth, their class. But over time, you start to see, with this second generation of painters, Botticelli, Leonardo, Ghirlandaio, that the figure starts to shift a wee bit. So you get a three-quarter, ultimately resulting in almost a full view of the figure. And again, while this is Lorenzo di Credi, we know that Lorenzo di Credi was very much looking at Leonardo. So again, it gives you a little sense of the evolution of portraiture for women in Italy at the end of the 15th century. Now, leaving there, we move into another thematic gallery that is life in Renaissance Florence, and this is a relatively new addition. In the old days, you really just went to European paintings to see paintings. Now there's a desire to incorporate decorative arts to give you a sense of daily life. Now, daily life is, not everybody lived this way, but important to sort of understand the role of marriage, of childbirth, some wonderful objects that incorporate, that sort of include works of art, but are brought in to give us a richer understanding of Florentine, specifically life in Florence, this wonderful wedding chest. And then very interestingly, with this idea of, again, global interaction, these marvelous plates, all of which had been ordered by Florentine clients, many of these objects coming from Spain. And again, what's so fascinating about these objects is that this style of the tin plate, the tin glaze, comes out of an Islamic tradition that was quite prominent in that Iberian Peninsula, which then gets very much loved and adored by people like Ferdinand and Isabella, and then becomes all of the rage in these Catholic households. So it's quite an interesting, again, this constant sort of flowing and changing of aesthetics. Then another room that highlights, again, the Met's extraordinary collection of Flemish painting, one of our great treasures, this Jan van Eyck Crucifixion and Last Judgment, and then some wonderful portraits by different painters such as Petrus Christus and Juan de Flan. Juan de Flan, another example, he was the favorite painter of Isabella. So Juan de Flan in Spanish means John of Flanders. He's brought down to Spain to basically engage with a lot of religious imagery, but he paints in the style of the Flemish. And then, of course, we have Messina, Antonello di Messina, as the conduit. And as you turn the corner, you see Messina's image of Christ, but you look down to Venice. So we move. One of the other things you need to note when you walk through European paintings to help you with this chronology, the paint color of the walls changes. So you know when you leave the 15th century and you move into the 16th century. It's very subtle, but it's very, once you look for it, you know it. Wonderful collection the Met has of Venetian painting. The Titians, we have quite an extensive collection, and this really shows you, again, this emergence of colore, of Venice as being as important of an artistic center as Rome, as Florence, and as places in the Netherlands like Antwerp. And again, the female nude starts to become a theme that we're going to see throughout the collection. From there, you walk into portraiture in European courts. Yet again, another mixing. In the old days, all of these portraits hung with their same sort of countries or regions, and now they're all mixed up to give you a real sense of what it was like to live at court in the 17th century. And you can see some wonderful, wonderful, iconic images from the Met's collection, and also some loans. And one of the things that I admire is they've tried to fill in the holes that really exist in this collection, one being the fact that we don't have any work by Sofonisba Agricola. And you're probably saying, who in the world is Sofonisba Agricola? And I said the same thing 20 years ago when they asked me to not teach 3 classes on Michelangelo, but I could only teach 2 because I had to teach a class on Sofonisba Agricola. And I said, well, are you serious? And I have come to admire this woman greatly. She's kind of considered to be the first female portrait painter of her era. She comes from a lesser noble family. She is hired by the King of Spain to be tutor to his wife, to teach her how to paint, and she becomes a court painter in Madrid. Very challenging, competing with a lot of male counterparts, and because she's never able to sign a lot of her work, she kind of goes into oblivion, but made many self-portraits and images of ladies in waiting at the court, which is what we have here. And these are now highly in demand, and so the Met, unable to acquire one, because we kind of missed the boat on that, has this marvelous loan. But again, you can see some of the favorites, the Venetians, the Florentines, you know, Holbein's images of the Germans in London, figures at the court of France, and they're all in here together. So it makes you aware, again, that there was a lot of movement back and forth with these courts. You know, there were marriages that took place, there were painters that went back and forth. So we can't really think of these areas as being isolated in any way. Now, the next gallery that I love in this selection, in this, what I'm giving you, this overview, is called The Origins of Landscape. And one of the things that we know is that landscape was, in the 15th and the early part of the 16th century, always considered something to be in the background. Again, the primary purpose of painting, if it's not portraiture, is often religious, and you're going to have scenes that take place, the figures that are important, not what's happening in the background. But we have this moment, and of course it coincides with the Reformation, when things start to change. And you can see this evolution, particularly in the work of a man named Patnier. And Patnier, if you look at this picture, it's a triptych, so yes, it's a religious altarpiece. It has religious figures, baptism of Christ, the St. Jerome in the center, and then my favorite, St. Anthony the Hermit on the right. But what it really is, it's a beautiful landscape that you can lose yourself into as you kind of wander. And essentially, what did Patnier want to do? He wanted to paint a landscape, but he had to keep these religious figures in the foreground to justify the genre. We see some other landscapes, Hieronymus Bosch, some of the great Italian landscape painters, and it all culminates in this magnificent work by Peter Bruegel, which focuses on the landscape in and of itself. and the work of the peasantry. One of the great old masterpieces, but again, put in a new gallery in a new way to think about how revolutionary it truly is. Now, some things don't change. We still have a gallery devoted to Vermeer, not to worry. The Met has 5 Vermeers, which is quite a large number when you think there are only 34, 35 out there. And then an entire room of the Rembrandts. That's still there as well. But as things change, there's new interest in still life painters, many female artists, and genre painting. The still life gallery engages with a rethinking of the whole notion of the vanitas, what was the purpose of this picture, and then looks very closely at quite a number of women artists, particularly a woman named Clara Peters, who's become extremely popular. The Met purchased this work for the reinstallation. Again, they've incorporated modern and contemporary artists. In this particular case, Adrian Piper, yes, that is me taking a selfie in front of this wonderful series of work. This is actually really fun. This is a reason to go to the Met. It's a scavenger hunt. Of course, the title, everything will be taken away, is a little bit disconcerting if you're in a museum, but there are 8 of these, and they're scattered, they're hidden all over the Met, and you can find them. And they're always in places that are, this room is about the vanitas, the objects, right? The obsession with the material. It will all be taken away. But there are some wonderful new female still life painters that are becoming very hot right now, both Italian and also French. This is an important painting to point out because this is one of the original purchased works. 1871, as I said, the Met starts, no staff, no collection. There's a bunch of men that go to Europe with some cash. They buy a lot of paintings. Half of them are fakes. But this one, they don't even know what they have. This was the only female painter in the entire Dutch collection up until 3 years ago when they bought that Clara Peters, which is sort of shocking because we have an enormous Dutch collection. But I said they didn't really know what they had, but Margarita Haverman is a highly respected, not only still life painter, but a botanist as well. Again, there's a marvelous room on genre painting. All the beloved Frans Hals are there on this fantastic wallpaper that you'll find if you go to if you go to Holland and you go to some of those wonderful canal houses. This is what the interiors look like. And of course, you're expecting Hals, you're expecting Jan Steen, but Judith Leister is there. Again, it's alone, but one of these very important female artists that was working during the same time period, gotten a lot of attention. Let's include her. Now you can see we're moving into our next century, which is the 17th century. We're going back because this is El Greco, who's 16th century. And what have they done with El Greco? El Greco was such an outlier given everything else that was going on during the time in which he lived, but so influential and so important to late 19th and early 20th century painters, people such as Cézanne, people such as Picasso. So they're incorporated in this room to make you aware of how very modern El Greco truly was. Then we keep moving, we get over to the other side, Spanish religious art. This is, again, something you would never have seen at the Met 10 years ago. A sculpture. These types of sculptures were very, very controversial at the time. They're painted sculptures, they're very religious sculptures, they're often used in religious procession, and these were the kind of things that Met curators would not have had any interest in. Marble was what it was really all about. But now this new type of painted sculpture has become very, very popular. And these polychrome sculptures also intend to be very lifelike. They tend to kind of make the saints and religious figures come alive. And again, in this room, you see the Islamic elements that impact many of the works that are done by the great Spanish religious painters. And then a more secular room where featured, of course, is on our right, you can see the marvelous Velázquez, the wonderful portrait, but also other works by Velázquez that show Velázquez is, in addition to Juan de Pareja, his great assistant, and we had a marvelous show on Juan de Pareja, which underscored the fact that yes, he was Velázquez's assistant, but he was also an enslaved person. And again, the challenges that he faced, and kind of rethinking who he is, not just as a painting by Velázquez, but thinking of him as an individual. And the gallery also has the traditional works by Velázquez as the court painter of Philip II. What they've included, and this really surprised me, because Columbus is really no longer terribly revered. Columbus is a tricky guy. And when you think about it, to have his portrait in this room, it really explains the wealth of Spain. Where did it all come from? It came from the explorations of Columbus. You can sort of read into that how you wish, but it's acknowledging that. And then very interestingly, right next door is the gallery devoted to the Americas, the Spanish Americas. So work that's being done in Mexico and in South America. And if you can see, the little door on the right leads you to the American wing. So it's a very lovely way of kind of showing you, again, this flow from, what's happening in the Americas and the relationship between Spanish artists who are coming to live in Mexico and South America to take advantage of the wealth that's there and also to speak to the needs of the Catholic Church. So as I said, it's a very interesting, almost everything in this gallery was acquired in the last 10 years. And then from there, so these are the kind of paintings, again, you would never have seen this in the Met's European Paintings collection 20 years ago, or this fabulous, this was bought, this is one of the first things the Met bought when they decided to really focus on South America. We call it the Crown of the Andes. It was a crown that went on a sculpture of the Virgin. This is a painting of the sculpture of the Virgin. Of course, the gold all comes from the Incas, but this marvelous crown was placed on the sculpture of the Virgin and displayed during feast days. It was desanctified and sold by the church and bought by this kind of crazy guy who kind of offered it to people for dinner parties, and you could rent it out. It kind of has a very kind of sketchy history in the 20th century, but the Met acquired it, and it's at the center of this gallery. So again, we get into what you might consider the British galleries, but we're not just looking at Gainsborough, Reynolds. You're now bringing in American artists that worked and lived in England at different moments, particularly Copley and Trumbull, and also citizens of Great Britain, thinking about, again, migration, about the relationship of India to that part of the world. But of course, you've got the old favorites, the Grand Tourists of Reynolds, and as I said, these American artists. So it's kind of there. Then we end the final galleries, we do get to the French. And the French remain hailed as, marvelous makers of taste. And again, in this gallery, very much about the Rococo. We're clearly in the mid-18th century, Louis XV. The importance of these royal mistresses, such as the Pompadour, to establish taste in France. So we have some wonderful Sèvres objects, you've got wonderful pieces of furniture, and then some marvelous examples of this kind of Rococo style with Fragonard and Watteau. There she is, the woman herself, Madame de Pompadour, very much in her Boucher style, and this whole gallery kind of a homage to that moment. Then we move from Louis XV to Louis XVI, and I love this gallery because this is the moment when the women artists become the most prominent artists at court. This is when they have their moment, and it features two wonderful painters, Vigée Lebrun on the left, and Adelaide Guirard, La Ville Guirard, in the center. And again, these are stories that have just recently started to be told about the relationship that both of these artists had with the court at Versailles. Vigée Lebrun is the court painter of Marie Antoinette. La Ville Guirard is the court painter of the Mesdames, the aunts of Louis XVI. And the relationship that they have with, again, the Academy is really a marvelous gallery that highlights this unique moment when women artists were really quite prominent, and also shows you some famous female still life painters as well. Leaving that gallery, we get into that very familiar gallery with Jacques-Louis David, of course, the famous fabulous couple of the Lavoisiers. And again, the theme thinks about politics, what's happening in this very revolutionary moment, and how painting plays a major role in that, but again, showing you some very beloved pictures. And of course, that kind of dovetails with images of revolution, particularly our favorite Jacques-Louis David of the death of Socrates. And then, of course, in the revolutionary moment, you also have Goya, and Goya painting in Spain, painting for the court of Spain, and then actually spending his final years in Bordeaux. So you see the life of Goya played out next to these galleries of revolution. And then there's a gallery that is now open for interpretation. And at this particular moment, the gallery has now since changed. The theme was artist studio. And we bring artists from throughout the European paintings collection and modern and contemporary to show you the idea of the painter in the studio. And you can look back to women artists from that time of the revolution. You can see Dutch artists living and working in their studios. You can see Matisse, you can see people like Elaine de Kooning, and they've even included this marvelous painting by Carrie James Marshall, a work that was recently acquired when we had the incredible retrospective of Marshall a couple years ago. Again, to make you think about the nature of the artist studio. It's not just assumed to be a male painter with a female subject. And again, we're kind of rethinking what we know and what we believe to sort of be the traditional subject. So again, that is European paintings. As you return back to, you made your way all the way around, you come out, and then ideally you should walk down the pathway and head over to the 19th century wing to pick up the story. Or you can leave the building. But I do want to just, you can leave the room if you've had too much. But I do want to say that this picture was always very intriguing to a lot of people, because if you're a real Met aficionado, you could, some of you, maybe in the room, could identify who all of these paintings, who all these pictures are who the artist is and who the subject is. Does anybody want to take a stab, or should I cheat and tell you who it is? Should I cheat? Okay, we'll cheat, because we don't have much time. But hopefully you can tell that, again, it's intended to show you some of the old favorites, the Goya, the young boy, or Juan de Pareja, or the fabulous Bronzino of the guy at the Florentine court, or Jacques-Louis David. And then you've got some new works, right? Some things that we haven't seen, the images from New Spain, and the William Wood portrait of the Indian housekeeper. So again, it's kind of intended to make you rethink a new light. Not only are you seeing these works in a new light with the new lighting system, but you're seeing them in a new light to think about all of these questions that have been raised about our culture and the role that art plays in it. So thank you so very much for that whirlwind.
Let's have some questions. Let's have a couple of questions. And while you're thinking of your questions and raising your hand, if you're European history fans, I just want to point out that on Tuesday, February 10th, we have Simon Winchester coming to talk about his latest book. This is the best-selling author. You probably know him from Professor and the Madman. He's written a new book called Breath of the Gods, and he talks about the course of European history, really civilization at large, and how affected it was by something you can't see, which is the wind.
Oh, I love that.
It's incredible. It's incredible. Just kind of how serendipitous the course of Western civilization has been because of a wind gust here and there. Certainly think of the Spanish Armada, think about all of that.
Hannibal in the Alps, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So if any of you have a question, raise your hand. We'll come to you. We're recording this, so we'd love to have the questions captured.
I noticed that some of the paintings in the new European galleries came from the Lehman collection, and I was under the impression that once they were in the Lehman collection, they had to stay there. Is that true?
Excellent question. Okay, so the way the museum works, there are 17 different departments. So there are basically 17 different museums within the museum. And once something goes in Lehman, it stays downstairs. You know, for example, the Goya's young sweet boy, Osorio, his mother is in Lehman. So his mom's downstairs and he's upstairs. But what does the Met do? So this is, if you look on the Met's website, you will see this as an ongoing exhibition. So when the Met has an exhibition, you can lend works to that exhibition. So the Lehman collection lends their painting to European paintings for this special exhibition. It's very clever. So now when you go on the Met's website, you'll see all of the galleries are shown as exhibitions, because so Rockefeller, they just reopened and they have a whole bunch of European paintings down there. So it basically allows for paint, you kind of skirt around the legality, so to speak. But yes, so as long as you keep it a special exhibition, you also then don't necessarily have to keep all of the paintings that were given by one person in one room at one time. That's another thing that this allows for. So it's an exhibition, but that's very savvy for you to know that. Yeah.
Do we have another question?
Yes.
Okay.
What is the status of the new wing, and what will be in it?
The new wing, you mean the Tang wing?
Yes.
Yes, okay,
The
well.
question was,
it's-
what is the status of the new wing and what will be in it?
Okay, and again, I'm not here speaking officially for the Met, but I will tell you that the money's been raised. Frida Escobita is the new architect. The plans have been approved by the city, and as we speak, things are being torn down, closed. So if you go to the Met, modern and contemporary is very limited. There's some things on the ground floor. Everything else is closed. It's going to take 5 years, and some casualties of that will be the members' dining room, unfortunately. But it will be a glorious 4-story collection with amazing views of the park, a lot more outdoor space. There'll be a rooftop on the 4th and the 5th floor. There's going to be some kind of like a Danny Meyer restaurant up there. And it's going to be much more open to the rest of the museum. And as I said, it will be done in 5 years. So what's going to be in it? Modern and contemporary. Works starting, give or take, about 1920, 25. They may move the needle a little bit as to what they see as modern, because if you go right now, Leonard Lauder's collection that he just recently passed away, so his collection came to the Met. That's in 19th century galleries. I don't know if that's going to go back into modern contemporary. I think it will. But they've been purchasing a lot of work, trying to, again, even out some of the holes in the Met's collection and give you a more diverse sense of what's out there. So those galleries will open in 5 years, and they will have glorious views of the park.
Friends, our art books are all the way upstairs in our nonfiction collection, and when you go there, if you pass the reference desk, you can check out museum passes for the Met from the reference librarian. This gets you into the Met completely for free.
I'm going to say that right now it's sort of an in-between time. The Divine Egypt show closed. I think Man Ray closed today. We have a great show on Helen Skarfbeck, who's sort of a star in Finland, not terribly well known in America, so she's on view at Lehman. But Raphael is opening at the end of March, and that is going to be a major moment for the Met, first major exhibition on Raphael to take place in the United States.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Paige,
All right,
for
thank
being
you.
here, and thank you all for coming out in
Thank
the
you
cold.
for having me.
Have a wonderful afternoon.